I'll start with a brief introduction. I'll also do a little bit of housekeeping to get started. For those of you who'd like to ask questions at the end of our presentation, we are reserving, around 10 minutes. Please you'll see that there is a Q&A tab on your screens. Please use the Q&A tab for the questions, and we will figure out how I'll be moderating that. Anyway, so to get started, I am an architect by training, a professor of architecture. I teach at Columbia University in sustainability management, and more than 10 years ago now, I was fortunate enough to meet Ira Rakatansky. I met him through coincidence, more or less. I met his son. We were sitting together looking at architectural student work at Rhode Island School of Design, and I was explaining how difficult it was to teach students about architecture in a city where so much of the architecture was traditional. And Mark Rakatansky, who you also see on your screen, who I will introduce in a moment, turned to me and said, "I think there's someone you need to meet." And that's who you're looking at right now, Ira. So Mark is a professor of architecture, an architect, and an architectural historian who lives and practices in New York and has taught at Harvard, at Columbia, at a bunch of different schools. Also joining us today is Thad Russell. Thad is a photographer and a professor of photography at Rhode Island School of Design. We met him because we were both colleagues when we began the project of going through Ira's wonderful archive and visiting his houses, and Thad did quite a bit of the photography that you'll see today. And the third partner, who can't be here today, is John Caserta, a graphic designer, photographer, and really one of the motors behind the project. We're also really fortunate today because we have Claudia and Len Iannicelli, who live in Ira's circa 1950s Jones house, and they'll talk a little bit about what it means to live with, and I'm going to use Mark's word here, live with Iratude. Anyway, the way the presentation will go, we have some slides from the book as well as several unpublished photographs. It's, by way of a tour. I'll talk a little, Thad and Mark will jump in. I will pass at the end to Mark, who will talk more about his about the context of Ira's career, but also about his perspective as an architect growing up with this wonderful architectural father. And then we'll have time for the Iannicellis to tell us about their experience with the house. So with that, we can start moving through images of the book. So I guess the first thing that I wanted to point out was that one of the reasons the book was possible, here you see Ira and his young family and his amazing wife, Lenore Gray, who was a gallerist in Providence. And it was really the teamwork of Ira and Lenore that made this book possible. Lenore was a tireless archivist of Ira's publications, his drawings, etc. And we found essentially everything intact. It's now at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard. I think it's important to understand what is both special and unique, and what is how can I put this? What is usual about Ira's work. And what I mean by usual is that the 1940s and 50s, the post-war period, was that there was a new class of architectural clients. There was a new set of materials and techniques that came out of the war effort that made it possible for the middle class to build for themselves. And especially in a place like New England, and this is something that Ira liked to talk about, there was no reason for them to try to imitate the Chippendales because the people down the street had original Chippendales. There was no reason to imitate the colonial because the colonial had happened in New England. So it's logical in a way if you look at the names of Ira's clients, that you look at who they were. They were Italian American, they were Jewish American. He was one of the first registered Jewish architects in Rhode Island. And there's a kind of synergy between modern architecture and these social changes, which is also what makes Ira's work so distinctly unusual, that there was such a small modernist movement in and around Providence. Ira was also a really important person in a larger sense in bringing the modern movement to the United States. He studied with Walter Gropius and Marcel Breuer, two protagonists of European modernism at Harvard, and he came from a construction background. His father was a contractor. He grew up around building. So he was someone who was able to translate some of the important ideas of European modernism into modern American construction. Here you see some images of the house that he built for his sister. It was his first independent commission. There was radiant floor heat. There was open expanse of glass. There was a very compact plan. These are all sort of traditional modern things, but there are also, you see here, some really particularly Ira things. The expressive hearth. He was very fond of quite enormous doors, several of which you will see today. There are other sort of special solutions that you'll see. So I would pass here to Thad, since these are his photographs you're looking at in larger format, so that Thad, you can talk a little bit about your experience shooting this house. Thad, don't forget to unmute.
Thank you. As a way of introduction, I just want to say that I want to talk about Ira today, and I also very narcissistically want to talk about me. And in particular, I want to talk about me and Ira together and how we came to sort of like have this moment where we got to sort of work together. And the truth is that I am neither an architect nor an architectural or conventionally trained architectural photographer. In fact, Lynette and her partner, the editor, John Caserta, found my work when I was exhibiting as a graduating member of the RISD graduate program in photography. And I was trained as a fine artist, not as an architectural photographer. And yet my father, it turns out, was an architect, and not unlike Ira, he was a New England-based modern architect who was trained in Boston by professors who basically had migrated across the Atlantic on either side of World War II and brought modern ideas with them. And so a lot of the defining features of an Ira house were features that were actually defining features of my father's house as well. And there were things that I was familiar with and things that I applauded and things that I was excited to see and to celebrate. Some of those things might include indoor-outdoor space, patios and decks, use of large unconventional pieces of glass plate for windows as opposed to more traditional window solutions, large open floor plans, sort of central hearths and fireplaces that seemed really critical and important. And I feel like I understood these, and I felt like growing up as the son of my dad and growing up indoctrinated really to the importance of these modern ideas allowed me to really understand what Ira was doing with his design and with his houses. The second thing I would say is that the fact that I wasn't trained as a conventional architectural photographer is really interesting, because I feel like at RISD, they, in the photo department, they really tried not to teach you how just to make pretty pictures. It's not a technical training, and it's not purely about aesthetics. It's really about content. And I feel like that allowed me to approach these Ira houses and these projects with a sort of an open, sort of creative mind. And I felt like I was seeking out not just, for better or worse, architectural moments, but also photographic moments that I thought were often adjacent to, but also essential to what Ira was doing. And so I took some poetic license and some liberties in order to make pictures that I thought were not just pretty pictures, but pictures that were that revealed the content of what Ira was trying to do with his designs and how I was seeing it and interpreting it. So this is the Rosen House. It's in Pawtucket. This picture here, I would say, is an example of like a sort of a photographic liberty that I took. In many ways, people would say, well, this is not an Ira. This hasn't shown me anything about Ira's design. Why would we include this picture? And I wouldn't totally argue that, but I would say this. Look at the size of that window. Look how beautifully unobstructed that view is. What it means to live in an Ira house, what it means to live in a modern house, is to have these designs that have these large panes of glass that allow natural light to come in, and that was all by design, and these great, amazing views out. So these, by design, this incredible connection between the indoor and the outdoor. And I feel like to live in this house is to entertain these sort of cinematic like views outside. Lynette, would you like to jump in?
Sure. I can pick up here. Thank you, Thad. Don't forget to unmute to mute. So I think here again you can see some of the special attributes of Ira's work. He was a dedicated modernist, but he was also completely undogmatic in his own way. For example, a fireplace like this, it has a lot of elements of later moments in modern architecture, whereas some of the other details that you see here, the open floor plan, the flat roof, are things that you would automatically periodize in the late 40s. I think in addition to his openness to sort of his own vision or flourishes, he was, and here I'm going on two pieces of evidence. I would hazard to say that he had amazing relationships with his clients. Two reasons for that. It was really surprising to me, and you see in the book pages, that we mostly used construction photos. So not construction photos, construction drawings. There were no other drawings. Ira never needed to produce persuasive drawings, not only because he was a persuasive personality, because he had an amazing trick, which was he'd sit down with his clients and they'd sit across the table from him and he would sketch perspectives for them upside down, extemporaneously. So they knew immediately that he could envision every space in the house, and that inspired a kind of amazing confidence. The other thing, he had a kind of boldness. Those last two photos that you saw were of Victorians, where he simply decapitated the top of the Victorians, removed all of the servants' quarters, and transformed them into modern residences for modern life. This house was one that Ira loved to talk about. It was in a subdivision, an early day subdivision, that required a peak roof to the street front. So what he did was to reorient the bulk of the house along that peak, and you'll see in these photographs how those two pieces interplay. So he called it a colonial front and a modernist exterior on the rest of the house. There are other examples. So this is a wonderful view. You can see how that peaked roof with a continuous rafters moves across, continues into the way the modern landscape is laid out. This house also has a kink in it in plan, so he is very comfortable with slightly idiosyncratic geometries in ways that are really of his own devising, not part of the so-called canon. You see that the edge of the fireplace where those two geometries sort of unhinge at a moment. So there's a playfulness to his work as well as there being a loyalty to the canon that he learned. And there you see in plan exactly what was going on. There were other innovations that he had. There's a wonderful example of a house that was built for a doctor where the doctor's office was included. And Ira invented a really complex and interesting way of moving through the house so that even though there was one front door and one back door, by virtue of where the doors were on the landing of entry, the people who lived in the house never crossed paths with the patients, which allowed the patients their privacy, right? Thad, are there some photographs here that you'd like to talk about, or up to you? But you'll have to unmute to talk to us.
Thank you. This is the Bleeding House in Warwick, which I loved, and I loved the young family that lived there, and I felt they really appreciated living in an Ira house. And that's one thing I'll say is that for the most part, most of the people who I visited in these homes were not the original owners. And there was a variety of awareness from owner to owner, new owner to owner, about whether or not they knew who Ira was, and they knew how special of a designer he was, and they knew how lucky they were to live in one of his homes, one of his houses. And this, as you can see, like very, beautiful open floor plan, very sculptural, very dynamic, beautiful light. And for me, what I'm particularly interested in the way people live in these homes. And, modernism is so funny because I feel like the dogma around it can be so strong, and the believers can be so and sometimes pure or rigid or something. And I'm always wondering, like, how do homeowners find their way in these spaces and in these homes, and how do they to what extent do they live according to these sort of like modernist dictates, and to what extent do they sort of just make the home their own? And I like, for instance, this boy, I just like that, I don't know if Ira ever envisioned, what would happen with this particular window. But I like the fact that this boy sort of like loved it as a view out, but also loved it as a canvas for his own artwork. Lynette, do you want to speak to Meeting Street?
Yeah, that would be great. So what you're seeing here is the office that Ira constructed for himself, including on the left side was Ira's office, the right side was the Lenore Gray Gallery, and the upstairs was ultimately a rental space. But believe it or not, this was originally a garage. And this is another instance of Ira daringly taking an existing historical building, which for this audience might sound like a complete nightmare, but pulling it back from the street, reconstructing it. And once you entered this building, you were completely in the world of, and I'll use it again, Iritude. I love that word. Anyway, Thad, you can keep going on the slides. because I want to talk a little bit about the interior. There you see Ira on the right and Lenore on the left. And again, you get the sense of where the windows are, of how the light moves through. There are details of these enormous doors, in this case with transoms, so that it's not just the view out, but also the ceiling is moving through. These are some shots of the rental space above the office. Again, with is slightly later than the original office. You can see Ira picking up on some more high modernist or sort of later, more established modernist language. But again, with the interest in non-traditional geometries, and here, speaking of non-traditional geometries, this is a wonderful project that we have John Caserta to thank for finding again. This was a nursery. I believe it's still functioning today. Here you can see it when it was first built. And you get a sense in this project that Ira's fluency in American construction, in simple, straightforward construction, and how to turn that into an architectural statement really came to the fore when he got not only to houses, but to some of the commercial projects that he did. And we have coming up images from drawings for actually a drive-in that he did. The Baker House here, this is on Blackstone Boulevard. This is another instance of Ira taking apart, decapitating Victorian, and this was a Victorian that had extensive servants' quarters. The entry, this portico, porte cochere, is quite beautiful. You enter over a little bridge. On the left is a pool house. On the right, you can see this is not a house we photographed on the interior. The clients didn't wish it, but there you see the bridge. And again, that enormous floor-to-ceiling door with that slit of glass that he used way back at the start in the house that he did for his sister. Here, too, you see that the clients have been really loving keeping things together. You can move ahead, Thad. Anyway, when I wrote about the book, I wrote specifically about the details for this drive-in because they are so simple, but they're so cleverly done to keep to some of the tenets of modernism, which are really thin profiles, very rational geometry, or very rational geometries, but also a kind of pleasure in new materials, new techniques, and new ways of building. So with that, at the next project is when I pass to Mark, and Mark will take us down the home stretch before the Iannucci's can speak about their house. So Mark, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynette. Thank you, Thad. Well, there's, of course, too much to say, but we're going to bring it on home, literally to the home that I was raised in, as well as my sister Lynn, who's in attendance here today as well. But before we do, just hang on one second, Thad. Go back, great. I want to, it's interesting that this later project, before we get to the house, is very timely because it's a church. Ira did many churches, Church of God and Saints of Christ, which is a fascinating group in Providence. He designed this for them, as well as the mother church later on in Virginia. They were a Afro-American Black congregation that wanted to practice as they felt Jesus had, meaning that Jesus was born into the Jewish faith, and so they had their Sabbath on Saturday. So it was a very interesting mixture, a Christian congregation that also had certain aspects and they hired Ira for this commission, and then, as I say, the later ground up large mother church in Virginia. I think it's very timely to talk about this because Ira, the progressiveness of Ira extended from culture to social conditions and awareness. And he made a point of, his liberal ideas about inclusion and about engagement with a range of populations is very timely to this moment. I remember him being on the council for the Boy Scouts of America in Rhode Island, and they were talking about what material to build their new building. He was acting as not as the architect there, but as someone on their council. And he looked around the room at the faces of the board of directors and the council in the room, and he said, unless you get some diversity in this room, you're going to need to build it out of some fireproof material because they should burn your building down. So that was Ira back in the 60s, being very aware of issues that are still engaging us at this moment. So that was his progressivism went through his entire life. I think we can move on, Thad. Great. So this brings us on home. And this was the second home he built. You saw the first one in Lincoln, Rhode Island, and he then came to Providence. This was a garage. This was a carriage house garage for the property behind. And Ira, interestingly, very interesting in terms of his engagement with these houses. You could say, in this case, he didn't decapitate. He kept the cap. He kept you can see the roof of the old garage, but he surrounded it and engaged it. So throughout the house, there was exposed brick walls. There were exposed wooden beams. So it was an interesting, and he left the red brick behind. He painted the brick white in front. Here he left it the natural color behind because he couldn't see it. When he saw it, he wanted it white. But nonetheless, it was still very present in the house. And it's an interesting, also timely moment where modern becomes a historic engagement. Hang on just one second, Thad. Hold on, I'll be right there. Modern becomes a historic style now, and so and the resistance that Ira got throughout his life to building modern houses in a colonial circumstance now gets flipped with Docomomo, where they now are over 50 years old and they get preserved. So there's all sorts of ironies that happen here that would certainly tickle and perplex Ira. But it's a wonderful thing that, because in fact he for all his modernism, engaged it subtly, directly, aggressively, in all sorts of manners. We can go ahead. There's that tall door, and that's what I want to say about the extraordinariness. What I coined yesterday as the Ira-tude, meaning he would take aspects of ordinary living and make them extraordinary, literally in this case. And the breakfast nook now gets enclosed, both connected and separated with the kitchen and the living room through this glazed condition. So it's both you can see and but it's also shielded at the same time. And then we get to the incredible living room with the exposed structure, engagement with the outside, inside. He loved this room. He loved to sit in his Eames chair over in the right-hand side of the screen. And then you have another extraordinariness here. So this is the along the wall as you enter into the house. There were two giant doors, 10-foot doors, because it was a 10-foot ceiling. On the left-hand side, close to the door, was a deep and tall coat closet. And then when you opened up the giant 10-foot door on the right-hand side, it was a 1-can deep pantry, which Ira would never, if we just go back for 1 second, Ira would never acknowledge when he was playing with these ordinarinesses. He just said, it was always a functional reason. He said, yeah, the problem with pantries is you can never find anything. So this way you can see everything immediately. But the actual humor of this, or the ingenuity of it, from going from a depth to a shallowness with this giant door, he would never cop to, as much as I tried to twist his arm about this. But it was always embedded in the work. Maybe we can go on to the next one. And then here you can see up on in the attic story, which became Lynn's bedroom when she became a teenager, and then later on a guest area and an area for Lenore to do some of her own artwork. That's on the right-hand side. But in both cases, on the left-hand side, you can see the exposed brick in the master bedroom. But on the right-hand side, you could see that Ira kept the beams and the major structure that was in the garage, carriage house, and the exposed brick as part of the play. This has the later addition of the expansion of the bathroom and covering over the front entryway. It was very important, this relationship of the landscape and the building, and it was really an incredible, wonderful forest with the house retired behind here, and it would glow out through the forest at night. And there we are back again. And there you can see the doors are, go back just one. There you can see the giant door that is right before you on the right-hand side, that handle, that's where the pantry is. So you can see how funny that would be to open that up. Next. Looking down the hallway toward the master bedroom, again, giant doors on the left-hand side for the washing machine and for some more storage. We're back to there. Yeah, next. Looking toward those doors. And the flooring, we noticed, the flooring that Ira would use in this case, having the tile that was related to the kitchen and the entry come into the living room. Again, I once, tried to catch him at this and say, like, what is going on with, like, why didn't you just, like, stop it over here, knowing full well that it was a play of the interaction between these two spaces. But his answer was, well, you have plants in the living room, and in case the water spilled, I didn't want to damage the wood. And Lynette smiled, so we know exactly, the way in which that is just Ira subterfuge. That was this Noguchi table from Knowles. Of course, all the furniture was the latest from the Saarinen and the Mies chairs and the Noguchi and et cetera, Eames. But that was cut special because of to make it fit into that room. So that is actually a unique item. Looking down the hallway, looking from the master bedroom down the hallway to Ira standing in the swinging door to from the kitchen to the living room. And again, that incredible forest, the way this emerged out in East Side Providence, not a view that you would expect. The structure, notice that he pulls it away from the wall in order to really show what it's holding and how it's holding. Again, the glow, beautiful. This was with Ira and I went through the list of projects, and this is really, of course, he did hundreds more of varying scales and fixes, but this was the chronology in the back of the book is really the ones he felt had the most Ira to. Range of different projects, office buildings, houses, churches, commercial projects. To Ira.
Can I go ahead and upload Claudia and Lenny's pictures now?
Yeah, I think that would be. So, Claudia and Lenny, sorry, Thad, could you mute, please? I just wanted to pass to Claudia and Lenny while the slides are coming up. I can give a little bit of background on your professional lives. I know it was in the program. Lenny, you are well, both of you, I think it's notable to say, have done a series of loving restorations and renovations of 17th and 18th century houses. I believe this is your first foray into modern architecture. But you come from, I think, a really interesting background of textile and apparel, preservation and curation, real estate, renovation, construction, and architectural passion. Your slides are up. With that, I will pass to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynette.
So my husband and I are delighted to be with you this morning to give you some insight into actually living in one of Ira's designs, which we purchased in 2002.
The purchase took no time at all. Needless to say, we walked in the front door and Claudia went one way and I went the other, and we met back at the front door in about 10, 15 minutes, nodded our heads and said, this is it. It was just what we were looking for. You know, it was built in 1963, as much as the plans evidently were done in the late 50s. And the home sits on a knoll, you can see from that photograph. We're on almost 2 acres. And as Thad had mentioned, it's one with the landscape. And both Claude and I love the outdoors. And it's really kind of special to live in a house that's always part of the outdoors.
Yeah, that open floor plan allows for a very free, comfortable, very creative work-at-home environment that proved to be really important during this past year. The house was designed again to be with the outdoors, one with the outdoors, and when the warm weather comes, the living space expands to an outdoor patio, a small porch in the front, a deck, and the large windows allow for a full, light, bright environment inside and out.
After we purchased it, our first step was to stabilize it. And honestly, that required the essential. The roof, for example, had to be replaced. Anything wood, the decking was really in need of repair, and the heating system. We were really looking at stabilizing it, and then we thought, as we live here, we'll be able to make other changes with more thought.
And Len and I really feel like it's important to understand the flow of a home, and you really need to live there for a while. So we never make any changes before we move in. And so for this house, we had to learn about what modernism was, but along with that, we had to learn about the Bauhaus design as the other houses we had done were from a much earlier period. So it was an interesting project for us.
We were really influenced by a visit to the Gropius house in Lincoln, and that answered a lot of questions for us. I think we had been living in the home for maybe 3 or 4 years, and there were all these like details, and we'd wonder about them, and they were all explained to us in the Gropius house.
Yeah, and a couple of details that we didn't really understand. The back staircase, it was very unassuming, and the staircases, and Gropius believed that staircases that lead to the second level should be private and not inviting to guests. So another example were these 2 small pin lights, which were located in the dining room of the original house plan. This room is part of the living room and would never accommodate more than 6 people at a dining room table. So this sort of had us baffled. But again, Gropius believed that a small dinner party was important as guests could talk together. Anything more than 6 would be a cocktail party. So again, that was a really important visit. And luckily, we had a great tour guide.
After about 5 years, though, we realized we had to make some changes with, for example, the kitchen, which in that period in the 50s and the 60s, kitchens were small and compact. And as you can see in this photo, we basically took a family room from the original plan that didn't have a whole lot of light in it. And we went forward with making that our kitchen, which for us accommodated the appliances that we wanted. We are vigorous cooks, and the rest of the family is as well. And we really wanted to do something, that worked for us. But it took a lot of thought, and we had to really debate that in many instances.
And at this point, we're looking at the bathrooms again, which are a bit small, especially the master bath that you can see on your screen right now. And again, climate control, as far as we're trying to climate the house, because it's getting much warmer in the summer, and it's quite warm here, especially on the second level. And that's been proved to be a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, we get together just about every New Year's, and we put a list together of the items that we feel really need to be maintained. And honestly, there's such a responsibility having not just a Rakatansky home, but a modernist home that's historic at this point, having been built in '63. It really requires careful thought as to what needs to be done. And a lot of this stuff is expensive. We've been fortunate that a lot of the materials, like this house was built with Anderson windows, and the same windows are available today. And we're in the process of changing our front door. And that's been really interesting, to have really craft people look at that door and inform us as to what it was made of and how we should replace it. And we're basically doing the same exact door again. So it's kind of neat that we have that availability to us. We also have available for our audience to go to a Matterport tour, which gives you a 3D perspective on the house. And I think that'll answer a lot more questions for you as well. And we're happy to hear from you. I just want to end by I'm so grateful to be working with a panel of such prestigious people as yourselves. It's been really fun.
Thank you so much. That was great. So we are a little bit over time on the original time, and I know that there are competing sessions, but for those in the audience, I think we had time for maybe 2, if there are 3 questions, and we're good. But if the audience has any questions that they'd like to type in, you could do that as expediently as possible, because we don't want to cramp the rest of your conference visits. So I will keep an eye on the questions. If there are no questions, then I would say I think Ira would be super happy to know that his work is appreciated, loved, lived in, that it lives, right? And that there has been, over past years, such a growth and interest, not only in his work per se, but in the kind of architecture of which he was a protagonist, in which he really believed strongly. So I guess I'll give it another minute or so. I don't see any questions coming in. I'll just ask if there's anything else that anyone else would like to add, and if not, I'll just thank the audience for having taken the time, and thank also my fellow panelists, all of whom I consider illustrious, for having been part of this today. All right, well, I think audience members, you are off the hook on questions. And with that, I guess we will close the panel. And again, thank everyone for attending.
Lynette, there was one question that just came in the chat.
I think I should probably, I don't know, Lynette, did you ever talk to Ira about Frank Lloyd Wright?
I did not. I did not talk to him about Frank Lloyd Wright. I mean, Frank Lloyd Wright is certainly not part of the Harvard GSD Gropius canon, quite the opposite. There was no love lost between them, but no, I never spoke to Ira about Wright. But Mark, if you want to jump in and answer that, then we'll take that question and then we'll sign off.
Yeah, I mean, it's an excellent question for all sorts of reasons, which have become quite integral to. But to answer directly, it really was the case, even though it all seems to get grouped together now. Frank Lloyd Wright really was a different strain from Ira's genealogy of coming through the modernists that came from Europe and then engaged American form. So the fact that Breuer and Gropius used wood siding, it's just that they turned them, again, they turned something ordinary, which is the horizontal siding, and turned it vertically. As Thad mentioned, porches were, of course, very much a New England form, but they incorporated them into a whole new way in the buildings. Ira, in fact, unlike Frank Lloyd Wright, Ira didn't believe in the hearth. In fact, it was because he was so uninterested in fireplaces that when he had to do a fireplace, he made them so interesting because he didn't believe in many of the tenets that the Wrightian school did. And nonetheless, we can now see many years later the way in which there was this great, not quite arms race, but this a game of chess between the two of them. So, Frank Lloyd Wright in The Falling Water said, okay, you guys think that you can do cantilevered horizontal planes? Watch me do this in Falling Water, and vice versa. So there were ways in which they kept playing off of each other. But again, the more direct answer is there was a appreciation, not quite grudging, but there was an appreciation for Frank Lloyd Wright, but not any particular attention. Yeah.
All right, well, thank you. There was one more question that came through in the chat about where Ira's drawings are archived. They're at the Harvard Graduate School of Design Library. They can be visited when COVID allows by appointment, but the amazing thing was that the librarian understood that everything belonged together, and in a move that is quite non-traditional, she agreed to take all the working drawings as well as all of the clippings, etc. So it is a complete and unabridged archive. And yes, we are waiting for the PhD who thinks that this should be taken on. All right. Thank you all so much. You've been a great audience. It's been lovely to see also so much appreciation in the chat. And with that, I will sign off. You guys can move on.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.